A lot of people, when they think of the phrase, how do I know, they always want to put the what behind it. How do I know what I'm supposed to do?
That is Michael Jr., a comedian and motivational speaker.
The question that you really should ask is, how do I know why I'm here? Because when you know your why, your what becomes more clear and more impactful.
Now, some context here. Michael performs all over the world, sharing this particular message. And during his events, he'll often stop and talk to the audience. Just have a chat. And one time in North Carolina, he calls out this one gentleman.
So you're a musical director? Cool.
Yes, sir.
All right, so let me get a couple bars of like Amazing Grace. Can you do the first part of that? Go ahead. Amazing Grace, how
All right, so it's pretty obvious the guy can sing. But that's not enough for Michael Jr.
Now, what you give me the version is if your uncle just got out of jail, you got shot in the back when you was a kid. I'm just saying, let me see the hood version real quick, if you know which version I'm talking about. Just see if that exists. Let me see what you got. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound.
By the way, you can see all of this on YouTube. The audience, they're losing their minds. So, why am I sharing this story? Well, it's simple. I want to do for you what Michael Jr. did for that music director. Now, Michael didn't teach that man to sing. He just inspired him to sing in a new and powerful way. Let's do the same thing for your storytelling. As humans, we're telling stories all the time. At weddings, at parties, at funerals, in movies and television and advertising. But at work? Not so much. And that is unfortunate because there are few places where stories can have more power to teach, to motivate, even inspire, just like Michael Jr. did for that music director, and just as I hope to do for you. This is StoryCharged. I'm Chris Nelson, your story charger, if you will, both for this podcast and the session that follows. Now, when I talk to leaders and ask why they don't use storytelling more often, a lot of them confess that they're self-conscious, unsure how to tell stories in ways that will matter to clients and colleagues. Well, the whole point of StoryCharged is to overcome that, to get people thinking about stories in a new context. In the next few minutes, you'll hear from an executive coach who will explain how he's using stories to drive performance. We'll speak to a professor who's devoted her life to understanding how stories affect our brains. But let's start with why stories are necessary in the first place.
If you have a complicated idea or you have a concept that you would like people to understand, just telling them what that is so much less interesting than hearing somebody's story that demonstrates it.
That's Steve Pratt, veteran storyteller, marketing consultant, and co-founder of Pacific Content, which has created podcasts for brands like Facebook, Dell, Morgan Stanley, Ford, Audible, and Shopify, just to name a few.
And this is a kind of a fairly classic best practice, showing instead of telling. I'll give you an example. There's one about an Everest expedition that went wrong, and it was that they had all made a decision to say, well, if we get to this point and the weather is bad, we're not going to summit.
Oh, you're talking about the expedition that was featured in the book Into Thin Air.
Yes. They got to that point and the weather was bad, and they're like, we're so close. We've spent so much time preparing for this and so much money. We're going to go for it. It'll be fine. And it turned out horribly. And then you kind of pull back from that, like, that's what sunk cost bias is. It's taking all the effort that you put into preparing that leads you to make bad decisions. When you're making a decision, take it at current value and discount all the things that have come before it. The Everest story makes you not forget what sunk cost bias is.
Steve, what you're describing is not unlike a case study at a business school. A concept in the abstract probably excites no one, but seeing it applied in real life makes people go, oh, I get it now. Why is it then that people in a business setting are so reluctant to use storytelling or, use it badly?
Yeah, I think the tendency is like you're thinking about what's in it for you, like why you're putting it out. Put yourself in the audience's shoes.
What you're saying is sometimes at work we probably care more about what we want to say than what people are prepared to hear. And we need to consider our audience first and ask ourselves what would inspire us.
When you're telling stories, you're actually creating images in people's heads. They're having theater of their mind. They're having little movies take place in their head, wondering what people look like, or when you're describing scenes for people, they're imagining all of it. And if I can get you bought in and imagining scenes in your head, you're in, like you win.
All of which begs the question, why? Why do stories work? Why is it that telling a story that gets people imagining things in their head is such a powerful way to connect? Well, that's something Suzanne Keene has devoted her life to understanding.
I am president of Scripps College and literature professor who works in an interdisciplinary field that involves the study of emotion and affect to any story.
And Suzanne has come up with a theory.
Narrative empathy is the version of empathy that we feel when we're sharing a story. So we encounter a narrative and we have the sensation of sharing feelings, sharing a perspective with an intense feeling of recognition and emotional fusion, but there isn't actually another person there.
So, in other words, we instinctively want to connect to others, even the ones in stories who are right in front of us. What prompts that?
We have this biological endowment that allows us to mirror and imitate others. It's part of how we relate to other people, and it happens because of mirror neurons. If I were to reach out for this coffee cup and grasp it and move it to my lips, in your brain right now, just because you're watching me do that, the mirror neurons about grasping and lifting and sipping are engaging.
So you yawn, I yawn.
Great example. Most of the time, when mirror neurons are helping echo in ourselves what is being experienced by somebody else, we don't always go so far as to imitate the action, but it is the basis for imitation. Storytelling hitches a ride on that.
All right, so what you're saying is there's a little voice in our heads urging us to copy the actions of those we hear about in those stories. But, Suzanne, I'll confess, I've heard a lot of stories that haven't moved me to emulate anyone.
But stories themselves possess three core emotional drivers independent of the content that is represented in the narrative. So curiosity, surprise, and suspense are the hooks that narrative itself, just as a toolkit, possesses. And those three core affects of narrativity are the drivers that keep us reading. It's what makes stories interesting to us.
Basically, what you're saying is a good story can alter your brain chemistry, like even just a little.
Yes, exactly.
And that change in brain chemistry is exactly what Peter Jensen wants his clients to experience.
Logic rarely changes anyone. Look, if logic changed people, no one would smoke, everybody would exercise. The fact of the matter is that emotion and imagination change people.
Peter is a sports psychologist and performance coach who works with some of the most well-known sports teams in North America, more Olympians than we have time to name in this podcast, as well as scores of executives.
Imagery is the language of performance. Your body doesn't speak English. And so the way I talk to business leaders, I'd say to them, who most wants to influence you in this life? Who are the people who most want to influence you? It's marketers, right? And then I'll say, what language do they speak? Well, they speak imagery. If they're trying to sell you a car and they want to emphasize the handling of that car, what's the road look like?
Peter, how do you motivate leaders who are skeptical about the powers of emotion and imagination?
Look, they want results, right? Sports people don't do things that don't produce results. Like if it doesn't work, it's gone. It's gone, right? And the great thing about coaches in sport is they don't fear emotion. They're not afraid of emotion. They recognize it for what it is. It's a way to develop people. It's a way to help people get better. I will ask leaders, what are people imagining right now? What do they imagine? Oh, they're thinking because we're bringing in this other client, the job may be in jeopardy, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you want them to feel? We want them to feel excited. We want them to feel motivated. All right. What images need to go into your communication with these people so that they can start to imagine that? One of the coaches said to me one time, the meaning of the communication is the response you get.
In this context, Peter, the response you're seeking is, say, better performance. And the most obvious way to get that response is through storytelling.
No question about it. I mean, Chris, that's what people remember. And it sticks.
Okay, so we've heard why stories are necessary, why they work, and how at least one expert uses them to transform people. But Steve Pratt says there's one last and crucial element people need to consider when telling stories to their colleagues and clients.
Knowing why you're choosing stories and what your values are, or what sort of emotional impact you want to have on people, and making sure you have those criteria every time over and over and over again, that consistency in what you're building is super important.
Amazing! All of which brings us back to Michael Jr. Now, as I mentioned, Michael didn't teach this music director to sing. He just inspired him to sing in a new way. The skills were already there, just as they are with you. All we're going to do is build on that instinct with a few tools to help you bring storytelling into the workplace and use it consistently to make a difference in the lives of others. That instinct is what you bring to our session together, and in fact, you're going to show it off. You see, I want you to story charge others. I want you to think of a story that will inspire your colleagues, because when I see you in person, I may ask you to share it. How's that for a cliffhanger? This is StoryCharged. I'm Chris Nelson. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in class.